Good day, my friends and companion in the world of imagination. The Dawn Treader stories present. Encuentro Con La Nana. The dictator lay awake in his enormous bed, the satin sheets clinging to his restless body like the skin of a serpent, suffocating him in its cold embrace. The ceiling above, high and distant, seemed to shimmer with a faint glow, as though the air itself had turned to glass. His eyes, dry from sleepless nights, scanned the room, vast and empty save for the shadows that clung to the walls, grotesque forms that twisted like scorpions poised to strike. He had not slept in days. Perhaps he had forgotten how. Outside the palace walls, the air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and somewhere in the distance, the steady hum of the sea could be heard, as persistent as his own doubts. But tonight, there was something else in the air, something heavy, foreboding, a silent tremor that rippled through the tropical night like the flicker of a dying flame. He felt it before he saw her. The presence slipped into the room like a cool breeze, curling around the bedposts, brushing the fine hairs on the back of his neck. He closed his eyes, telling himself it was the fatigue playing tricks on him again. But when he opened them, there she stood, at the foot of his bed, draped in the same threadbare shawl she had worn the day she died. "Nana," he whispered, his voice trembling like the wings of a dead butterfly caught in a windstorm. Her face was gaunt, eyes as hollow as the moon above the palace, but she looked at him with a tenderness that seared his heart. He hadn't thought of her in years, not since the day they buried her under the ceiba tree, her favorite spot in the garden. She had raised him after all. Fed him milk from her own breast when his mother could not. Told him stories of gods and spirits, of serpents that swallowed the earth and scorpions that guarded secrets hidden in the cracks of the universe. The dictator sat up in his bed, his body stiff, as if frozen by some unseen force. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest tight with the weight of all he had done, all that had led him to this moment. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. "You've grown, mi niño," the ghost said, her voice softer than he remembered, a whisper that stirred memories he had long buried. "But you are not the man I thought you would become." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I had no choice," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "No choice," she echoed, a trace of sadness in her voice. "No choice when you sent soldiers to the plaza? No choice when 12 children fell to the ground, their blood soaking the earth, like the venom of a scorpion dripping into a wound?" His heart clenched at her words, and for a moment, he saw them, those 12 young faces, full of hope and fire, the way they had gathered in the plaza, banners raised, voices lifted in protest. He had ordered their deaths. The memory was like a snake, coiled in his gut, tightening with every breath. "They were a threat to order," he said, more firmly this time. "To peace." "Peace?" She laughed, a soft, broken sound that filled the room like the flutter of moths drawn to flame. "Peace is not built on the bones of the young, mi niño. Peace is a garden tended with care, not a battlefield soaked in blood." He clenched his fists, the cool night air turning hot against his skin. "You don't understand. The world I govern is not the world you knew. These people, they are ungrateful, rebellious. They spit in the face of everything I have built. I've kept this country alive." The ghost drifted closer, her form almost translucent now, as though the weight of his words were scattering her to the winds. "You were a kind child," she whispered. "Once long ago. Do you remember? You cried when you found the dead butterfly in the garden, its wings crushed by the wind. You told me you would never hurt anything so fragile." He winced, the memory piercing him like a knife. "That was a lifetime ago." "Was it?" she asked, her gaze piercing through him, as though she could see into the marrow of his bones. "Or did you choose to forget?" Outside, the faint murmur of voices rose into the night, drifting through the open windows. He stood, his knees weak, and crossed to the balcony, his heart pounding in his chest. Below, in the square outside the palace gates, a crowd had gathered, peasants, farmers, students, their faces lit by the flickering flames of torches they carried. They had come to protest, to demand answers, to grieve for the dead. "You see," he said, gesturing to the crowd below. "They hate me, Nana. They will never understand the burden I carry." The ghost followed him to the balcony, her eyes scanning the mass of people. "They do not hate you, mi niño. They fear you. And fear is a venom that eats away at the soul." He clenched the railing, the cold metal biting into his palms. "I did what I had to. I have no regrets." But even as he said it, he felt the weight of the lie, like a scorpion crawling inside his chest, its sting sharp and undeniable. The ghost's eyes softened, and for a moment, he saw the woman who had once rocked him to sleep in her arms, who had told him stories of love and sacrifice, of honor and courage. "I am proud of the man you were," she said quietly. "But I am ashamed of the man you have become." Her words struck him like a blow, and for a moment, he felt the world shift beneath his feet. The crowd below had grown louder, their chants rising into the night like the hiss of snakes slithering through the jungle. He could hear them now, the names they called him: tyrant, murderer, butcher. You could change it all, the ghost said, her voice barely a whisper now. You could save them. You could save yourself. He turned to her, his face pale, his eyes burning with a strange mix of fury and desperation. And what would you have me do? Surrender? Face their judgment like a common criminal? She did not answer, but instead reached out her hand, her fingers brushing against his temple. In that moment, a vision consumed him, vivid and unrelenting. He saw himself standing in a barren courtyard, his hands tied behind his back, a line of soldiers before him, their rifles aimed at his heart. He heard the crack of gunfire, felt the sharp sting of bullets tearing through his flesh. And then the silence. The deep, hollow silence of death. He gasped, pulling away from her, his body shaking. No, he whispered, his voice ragged. I've done nothing wrong. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch beyond time. Perhaps, she said softly. But in the end, it is not for you to decide. He turned away from her, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He could still hear the crowd below, their chants growing louder, more insistent. And yet, as he stood there, gazing out at the sea of faces, something inside him hardened. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. With a deep breath, he squared his shoulders, his back straightening with the resolve of a man who had chosen his path. He would face them, not as a penitent, but as a leader, a man justified in his actions. Without a word, he strode from the room, the ghost of his past lingering behind him like a shadow, watching as he descended the grand staircase and stepped out into the night. The crowd surged forward as he approached, their voices a wave crashing against the walls of the palace. But he did not flinch. He walked towards them, his chin held high, the weight of his sins hanging from him like a crown of dead butterflies, fragile yet unbroken.